Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library, Georgia Equality, and Lambda Legal for our program, Georgia on My Mind, a 2020-2021 LGBTQ legislative overview and issues in celebration of Pride Month. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I work for Gwinnett County Public Library's Adult Services Department. Joining us from Georgia Equality is Deputy Director Erick Paulk. Erick Paulk is a lawyer and advocate working on issues impacting LGBTQ communities and communities of people living with and vulnerable to HIV acquisition. He currently serves as Deputy Director and oversees all day-to-day operations, developing and managing local, state, and federal policy and advocacy activities that advance equity and fairness for LGBTQ communities and improves public and private responses to the HIV epidemic. Prior to joining Georgia Equality, Erick served as the Tyron Garner Fellow at Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest organization dedicated to advancing the civil rights of lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender people, and individuals living with HIV. Erick is an accomplished author, published in the Huffington Post, the Atlanta Voice, Project Q magazine, and others. Erick is a graduate of Morehouse College and received his law degree from Pace University Law School. Also joining us tonight is Michael Shutt, Southern Regional Director of Lambda Legal. Michael has 20 years of experience providing strategic leadership in higher education at Emory University and the University of Georgia. At Emory, he served in several roles, including the Assistant Dean and Director of the Office of LGBT Life, Interim Senior Director of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and Senior Director of Campus Life. Prior to his work at Emory, he advocated for and served as the founding director of the University of Georgia's LGBT Resource Center, the first LGBT resource center at a public university in Georgia. Michael is the chair of the board of directors of the Equality Foundation of Georgia and a member of the LGBTQ Institute Advisory Board at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. Michael received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Public Administration from Michigan State University and Doctor of Philosophy in Student Affairs Administration from the University of Georgia, where he currently serves as an adjunct assistant professor in the College of Education's Department of Counseling and Human Development. Everyone, please welcome Erick Paulk and Michael Shutt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this evening. I'm going to share my screen, and while I'm doing that, I will let Erick kick us off.
All right. Well, one, thank you, Miriam, and good evening, everyone, and happy Pride Month. We are really excited to be here with all of you tonight. You know, my friends and partners at Lambda Legal and our new friends at the Gwinnett County Public Library. And, you know, just are really excited to be here tonight to really dig into some really important topics that are impacting LGBTQ communities here in the state of Georgia. And so tonight's conversation will focus on Georgia's 2020-21 legislative session, some federal LGBTQ legislation, as well as a discussion on some local legal concerns. And so Miriam has done a really amazing job of doing some introductions for us. And so I'm gonna toss it over to Michael just to give us a bit more of an overview of our conversation this evening.
Yeah. Thank you, Erick. Just in case you didn't get enough of seeing us, there's another little flash of us, but thank you, Miriam, for the introduction. But tonight we are starting to do an overview of Georgia Equality and Lambda Legal, so our friends out there in Gwinnett County and elsewhere who are not that familiar with the organizations. We wanted to share a little bit about ourselves. And then we are going to jump right into a review of what happened over the last year, specifically as it pertains to LGBTQ related issues and issues around HIV. Then we're going to sort of widen the net on this because there has been a lot of conversation and a lot of legislation that's been introduced specifically around this country that is really anti-trans legislation. And so we're going to touch on that and dive into some of the specifics. And then talk a little bit about federal law, because although this is Georgia on our mind this evening, the things that are happening in Washington, D.C. will also impact us here in Georgia. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. As we go through, I'm actually running the PowerPoint, so I'm just going to rely on my colleagues for, to shout questions that may be coming up. We encourage people to put their questions and comments into the comment box along the way. And then we will just, if you will just let me know that those questions are coming in, we will facilitate those answers. So that is how we are starting off. And we are gonna then, as the overview says, we are gonna jump in and introduce ourselves as organizations. So Erick.
All right, thank you, Michael. So Georgia Equality. Georgia Equality is a statewide policy and advocacy organization focused on issues impacting LGBTQ communities and communities of people living with HIV and vulnerable to HIV acquisition. We are both a C3 and a C4 organization. So our C3 work focuses on our programming work. So this includes all of our voter registration and our voter engagement work. And our C4 focuses on passing pro-equality legislation and electing fair-minded elected officials. We go to the next slide, Michael. And then just to talk a little bit about our core work, some of our core work includes, as I've mentioned, civic engagement and voter registration work, our HIV policy and advocacy work, trans and gender-related policy and advocacy initiatives, non-discrimination, and our safe schools work. Georgia Equality has been doing this for 25 years now. Actually 26 years. Last year was, during COVID, was our 25th year. And so we hope to have another strong 25 years of supporting and providing protections for LGBTQ communities. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Michael to talk just a little bit more about Lambda Legal and the amazing work that they do.
All right, so as Erick and I, in our introductions, you found out, so I have some ties to Georgia Equality and Erick has some ties to Lambda Legal, so it makes sense that we're presenting this together. Lambda Legal is a national organization, and it was founded in 1973, and it is the oldest and largest national legal organization whose mission is to achieve full recognition of civil rights of LGBT people and those living with HIV. And we do this through impact litigation, policy work, education, and as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, we actually don't receive any money from the government, and we are supported by contributions. And so we make sure that our clients do not have to pay for our legal representation. We do have 6 offices across the country. So Lambda Legal in Atlanta is actually 24 years old this year, but we have offices in New York, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. And so we are doing this work in a variety of ways. One of those ways is impact litigation. And what that means is that we take on cases that will have a larger impact to the community than just the individual that's involved in that case. So for example, we have a case, the Andrew Adams case out of Northern Florida, and this student wanted to use the boys' bathroom. He identified as a boy, but the school system said that he was not allowed to use the bathroom because he wasn't, quote, biologically male. And so we sued, and that case, we won that case, and then it went to the 11th Circuit. And so we're still litigating this case, but this means if we win this case, that students in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida will be able to use the bathroom in their schools, regardless of their gender identity. And so that is having a much larger impact on the community than just as an individual. We also engage in education, which you can see now as our participation today, and public policy work. And a lot of that in Georgia is partnering with Georgia Equality. So over this last legislative session, we worked very closely with what the state of Georgia specifically needed from a group of engaged attorneys. And so we engaged with the legislature, the governor, et cetera, when it came to bills related to trans folks and other LGBT folks, as well as HIV. So that's really sort of a quick snapshot of the work that we do and have been doing for the last 48 years across the country. I do want to make a note that Lambda Legal is a national organization, and we're really grateful that we actually partner with organizations across the country. This type of work, movement work, LGBT work, can't be done in a vacuum. So we've worked with Georgia Equality for years and years, and although we have really different roles to play, it's our relationships that make it possible to get this work done. And as you can tell, Erick and I really enjoy working together and are sort of in lockstep, trying to make sure that people have their rights to live full equality. So, Erick?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, Michael is absolutely right on board with our love fest, and our really great partnership that we have. The work, as Michael said, does not happen in a vacuum, and partnering with organizations like Lambda really has been critical to a lot of the success that we've had, legislatively, and so much of the work that we've done and pursued. And so Lambda, often serves as an advisor on the legislative work that we do. They also are great and amazing thought partners when it comes to thinking about the types of things that we should be working on, the issue areas that are important, things that may be cropping up nationally that they're seeing as trends as sort of our national partner. All these ways to really help us do our jobs better. And so we are definitely grateful for that relationship and partnership with Lambda. And so with that, we will hop into the 2021 legislative review. And so I want to take a look at about 5 areas tonight and really focus on two or three in broader detail. So AntiTrans Bills, Michael mentioned that he's also going to take a bit of a deeper dive into that, just based off of what we've seen happen nationally. HIV decriminalization. So as Michael mentioned, and as I mentioned, HIV is a critical part of our mission at Georgia Equality, and a part of the mission of Lambda Legal. I think that we'd also be remiss not to recognize, while we're having this conversation, we are commemorating, the 40th year since the first 5 cases of HIV were diagnosed. And so this is also a time for us to think about that work, the work that needs to happen moving forward, and also be reflective on all of the success that we've had over the past 40 years. Another area is voter suppression, conversion therapy, and then comprehensive non-discrimination. And so this legislative year has been record-breaking for the number of anti-trans bills that were introduced. 31 states have introduced bills that ban transgender athletes from participating in sports consistent with their gender identity, including Georgia. Here in Georgia, we had 4 bills that were introduced. We were lucky in being able to defend against these bills, where other states, as I'm sure folks have seen, were not as lucky to be able to defend against. And this has been really critical, especially here in the South, where we've seen so many of these bills pop up. What we know based off of what we've seen this year is that these bills are going to keep coming, and that we need to be prepared and armed to fight against them. And that means, doing some of this work, which is, community education, so people understand the importance of advocating for advocating around sexual orientation and gender identity, and really advocating for trans youth who are under attack right now, and understand that, while these bills now are focused on trans youth and trans athletes, that trans adults will eventually be pulled into the fray as well. And so that we need to really be prepared and thinking about what that looks like moving ahead. Next, I'm going to talk a bit about HIV criminalization, and some of the work that Georgia Equality has specifically been doing around that. And so HIV criminal laws in Georgia criminalize the transmission of or the perceived exposure to HIV or other infectious diseases. The laws create a strong disincentive for being tested for HIV, and result in adverse public health outcomes. Georgia's laws criminalize behavior such as spitting that have no risk of HIV transmission. So this year, SB 164 was introduced. It's Georgia's HIV criminal reform bill. It actually failed on the last day of the legislative session, after historically passing out of both chambers. And so there was and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the bill would remove provisions around solicitation, needle sharing, blood and organ donation. It will remove enhancement penalties around spitting on peace officers and spitting on correctional officers. Additionally, the bill would require the intent to transmit, and that sexual acts must include a significant risk of scientifically supported levels of risk of transmission. And so things like spitting or biting, which are in the Georgia law, would be removed because we know there's zero risk of transmission through those modes. The bill would also add provisions that protect victims of sexual assault. And, like I said, on the final day of the session, unrelated language was added to the bill. This is sort of a common practice that happens late in the session, where bills that haven't made it far are essentially looking to hitchhike on bills that look like they're going to pass. And so following the addition, the bill received a unanimous vote out of the House. The bill moved back to the Senate, where the original bill sponsor objected to the substitute language. And so due to time limitations, the bill stalled. So it'll pick back up next legislative session, hopefully without any of that amendment language, and hopefully we'll be one of the states who reform their HIV criminal laws in 2022. Next, voter suppression laws, very critical for folks who are a part of the LGBTQ communities to think about and to have some advocacy around. And so during this legislative session, the governor signed into law a bill that adds many obstacles to voting, including reducing the number of ballot boxes, shrinking the window for early voting, adding additional photo ID requirements, and allowing state officials to circumvent the work of county election officials if they don't like the outcomes that they're seeing. The bill even goes so far as to make it illegal for outside groups to give water or food to voters stuck in long lines. Voter suppression laws are felt more acutely by LGBTQ folks. We know about horrible voter ID laws that harm folks who are members of the trans community. And so folks who are, at the intersections of multiple identities are going to be, more acutely harmed by these voter suppression bills. I think it's important for us to remember that voter suppression, just like climate change and infrastructure and racial justice, are all LGBTQ issues. Our fight, and this is, will be demonstrated in some of the conversation that we'll have tonight. We built our fight for equality on the backs of fair elections. So all of the pro-LGBTQ laws that we have locally, statewide, and nationally were passed because we were able to elect LGBTQ allies and LGBTQ folks to political office. And so, while this may not directly feel like an LGBTQ issue, it is absolutely an LGBTQ issue that we should be advocating for, and our hair should be on fire that we actually, have a governor that signed this into law this year. And so those were the three areas that I really wanted to focus on. Conversion therapy, a lot of that work has been led by Matthew Wilson. He introduced a piece of legislation, didn't get very far this legislative session, around banning conversion therapies for minors, and then comprehensive non-discrimination bill. Georgia is one of a few states that don't have a comprehensive non-discrimination bills. And so one of our main objectives, one of the things that we want to do, is pass a comprehensive civil rights non-discrimination bill here in Georgia. And so that is something that's critical to the work that Georgia Equality is doing. We've been doing a lot of local work around passing local ordinances. And so using that as a strategy to hopefully get a statewide bill passed. And so then let's just take a look at some of the highlights and the lowlights. So as we mentioned, while we were not able to pass the HIV criminal reform bill this legislative session, based off of this year, that there seemed to be no controversy to its passage, that hopefully we'll be able to get that across the line in 2022. We are in the 8th year running that we have stopped all anti-LGBTQ legislation. That is a feat in the South, to be able to tout that as a win. And then $15 million was added to the state budget for the AIDS Drug Assistance Program. And so we consider that to be a big win as well. Some of the lowlights, as we mentioned, the attacks on voting rights with the passage of SB 202, and then the attacks that we've seen on trans youth and trans athletes, that's likely to continue. And so things for us to think about as we think about 2022, things to think about during this cycle where there are a number of municipal races happening. And so yeah, and so I'm gonna pass it over to Michael. He's gonna dig into some of this a little more specifically, especially around this trend of these really horrible anti-trans laws.
Thank you, Eric. So, if you see the photo here, I mentioned Andrew Adams out of Florida earlier. This is Andrew and his mom right after they were in court in the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, actually in December of 2019. So this is a really long game to play for sure. So I want to take a moment to focus specifically on anti-LGBTQ laws across the country. As Eric said, we've been really lucky this year in Georgia because none of these laws moved out of the legislature to the governor's desk. We know that there are members of the legislature who are ready to move on them again in the 2022 session. In fact, we know last week at the Republican convention, that there was a resolution that was adopted that called on elected officials to move laws forward that would actually be anti-trans law related to bathrooms and sports. And so, it is not something that's happening in a vacuum or in secret. These are public meetings that folks are staking a claim to discriminate against others. And I really want to be clear, as organizations, as one of the organizations that is tracking these bills, this is like playing whack-a-mole. Or this year, for those of you that are living in the cicada areas, it's like whack a cicada. Because over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in 2021 in state legislatures. And these bills included bills that enable discrimination, such as religious freedom, campus free speech bills, and engage really in the erasure of LGBTQ people within school curriculum. Many of these bills specifically target transgender people, and more specifically transgender youth. And you can see some of the themes in these bills listed here, but I'm going to focus specifically on sports bans and healthcare bans, because these are the ones that were really sort of pushed through a lot across the country. So the sports bans, these bills varied a bit from state to state, but most will only allow participation in sports in schools based on biological sex. They also establish a private cause of action for students who believe they were deprived an athletic opportunity or who suffer direct or indirect harm if there's a violation of the act. And so this means that they can take action against the school if they suspect someone's transgender and they had to compete against them. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and this is what the legislators across the country decided to prioritize in their states. Now, the fact of the matter is that we know that participation in sports is an important part of a student's physical, social, and emotional well-being. And we know that 25 states have successfully implemented policies that allow transgender youth athletes and their peers to successfully participate. These laws will do harm to transgender youth by increasing alienation, bullying, and discrimination. And so basically, they're being introduced to create a problem rather than there's a problem to address. And so they're passing those laws. So that's the athlete piece. Then there are the healthcare bans, and these are even more troubling. So again, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and legislators decided that it would be a really great idea to introduce legislation banning access to healthcare, even though the largest and most respected medical associations oppose such bans. Most of these bills stop minors from receiving gender-affirming care, even if their parents, their doctors, and other healthcare professionals support this life-saving care. So basically, we're trying to govern healthcare. Some of these bills go so far as making the violation of these laws a felony, not just for medical professionals, but also for parents, school administrators who don't report parents and the children if they're getting this care. So it means that we could be arresting parents for providing health care and supporting their children. And here's the thing. For almost 50 years, opponents of LGBTQ folks have tried and tried again to discriminate against us by using children as pawns. For those that are familiar, Anita Bryant and the organization Save Our Children defeated or overturned pro-LGBT laws in the 1970s. John Briggs in California pushed Proposition 6, also in the 70s, that would have banned gay and lesbian people from working in California schools and protecting children from homosexuals, quote unquote. That law actually failed in California, but I just want to point out that it wasn't okay then, and it is not okay now. And we know that this discussion was meant to focus on Georgia, but the truth of the matter is that Georgia is in the center of the universe right now, given our past election and everything around voting rights. So we therefore want to spend a moment talking about what's happening in Congress related to HIV voting, and a few other things. So I'm going to turn it back over to Erick to talk to us about what's happening in Congress.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And so, yeah, let's switch gears a little bit to talk about some legislation bubbling on the federal level. And so, like Michael said, our focus here really is on, two of the big topic areas that we've talked about um, are HIV and voting. And so we'll kind of keep that theme going as we're talking about some of these um, federal initiatives. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the repeal HIV Discrimination Act, the HIV Epidemic Loan Repayment Program HELP Act, the Equality Act, the For the People Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We'll also talk a little bit about the judiciary because we feel like that's another area for us to be thinking about in a place where we, definitely need representation and a bit more diversity when we're thinking about nominations. And so Congresswoman Barbara Lee reintroduced, she, has introduced this bill several times. Hopefully, as we, are entering again, I mentioned the, 40th commemoration of AIDS this year, that there'll be more thought, more buy-in around what we need to do to really end the epidemic. But the Repeal Act works to eliminate harmful consequences of dangerous and stigmatizing laws by creating incentives and support for states to reform existing policies that use criminal law to target people living with HIV for severe punishment and felony charges for behavior that is otherwise legal or that poses no measurable risk of HIV transmission. And so this bill would support the work that organizations like Georgia Equality is doing around reforming HIV criminal laws on the state level. 30 plus states have HIV criminal laws on the books that discriminate against people who are living with HIV. The previous administration said they wanted to end HIV by 2030, but we know that we are not able to end HIV without getting rid of these laws. And so that's just a little bit about the Repeal Act. We think that is important. We hope that it gets additional bipartisan support, especially in this time, in this moment, where we are really thinking about what an AIDS-free generation looks like. And so next, talk a little bit about the HELP Act. It was introduced by the late Representative Congressman John Lewis in 2020. And the HIV Epidemic Loan Repayment Program HELP Act addresses the urgent need for HIV clinical providers. So it supports a robust HIV workforce by authorizing a new loan repayment program offering up to $250,000 in loan repayment to physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, clinical pharmacists, and dentists who provide HIV treatment in health professional shortage areas or Ryan White funded clinical sites over the course of 5 years. It also provides people living with HIV more access to physicians specializing in HIV treatment by increasing the accessibility of the field to clinicians entering the workforce. And so, this is very important as we sort of also think about Georgia. And we think about things like the closing of rural hospitals that are happening. So as hospitals and services, become more scarce in rural areas, what does that mean for people who are living with HIV? And the HELP Act would help to provide some additional support around making sure that folks in these areas can stay healthy, have access to the medication and to the services that they need to stay healthy. And so that's another piece of legislation that I think that we should, be on the lookout for. If you see any places where you can insert some of your advocacy, that may be a place for you to do some of that. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michael. He's going to talk a little bit about the Equality Act and a couple other things on the federal level.
Yeah. So, thank you, Eric. All of those pieces of legislation are really important, and so is the Equality Act. And here's the thing: we have been trying to pass the Equality Act for almost as long as Lambda Legal has existed. So we opened our doors in 1973, and the Equality Act was introduced in 1974. The Equality Act will update existing federal non-discrimination laws, and this will take us beyond the great decision we received in Bostock last year related to employment last year. And so many folks don't realize that there isn't federal law that is protecting LGBTQ people based on employment, public accommodation, housing, fair federal funding for federal funding, healthcare, jury service credit, and education. And so the Equality Act would change federal law so that there are these protections in place. And so we are waiting to see what is going to happen in the Senate. The House has passed the Equality Act. As Eric said earlier, voting rights are really important to talk about in Georgia. And once again, the late, great John Lewis's name rises into our thoughts and our hearts with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And it would restore and strengthen parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And you would need to get pre-clearance if there are changes, meaning you would need to check with the federal government if there were changes in elected practices in diverse areas, if there were changes in documents required to vote or register to vote, if there were reductions in access based on language, and if there were reductions in polling locations in diverse locations. And so, if people just decide to move in and change some things around, and the federal government thought that was being done to suppress votes, that would then stop. So if signed, this would begin to undo some of the racist voter suppression tactics implemented and proposed in many states, including Georgia. In addition, and speaking of voting, we're also watching the For the People Act, which would increase and expand voting rights, increase election security. It would also address gerrymandering, campus finance, and ethics. And again, all of these issues are front and center in the great state of Georgia. And so, we feel like the center of the universe, and that's impacting what's happening in DC. So the last thing that we want to really focus on then is the last branch of government for the evening, and that is the judiciary. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Eric.
Yeah. I just want to add one more thing. You talked about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and if the John Lewis Voting Rights Act were in place now, Georgia, the law that passed in Georgia, would have had to meet the pre-clearance standard, and so it wouldn't be law right now. And so, I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind as well as we're thinking about this. But we're going to talk just a little bit about, the judiciary, and, really just how representation is important. And so LGBTQ judges are drastically underrepresented on the bench. And the data really bears this out. So those who identify as LGBTQ comprise fewer than 1% of sitting judges and only about 1.4% of active judges on the federal bench. The first federal judicial appointee who self-identified as LGBTQ was Judge Deborah A. Batts. She wasn't appointed to the federal bench until 1994. So 1994 wasn't that long ago. I remember 1994 very well. Uh, there are no federal judges who self-identify as transgender. There's only one openly LGBTQ federal circuit court judge. That's Judge Todd Michael Hughes, who serves on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the federal circuit. And then the federal district court judges who self-identify as LGBTQ are concentrated only in a handful of states. A few openly LGBTQ judges preside over districts and courts in New York, with others serving in district courts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Oregon, Illinois, Florida, and California. Notice only one southern state in that list. And so we also have 0 Supreme Court justices who identify as LGBTQ. And so I'm going to hand off the baton to Michael, because he's going to kind of broaden this picture for us, paint this picture a little more for us.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So Lambda Legal just published a report back in January, and the court piece is, the judiciary piece is really important and a little bit challenging to look at if you look at what has happened over the last 4 years. So former President Trump ushered in a landscape that was significantly more hostile towards LGBTQ plus people. We know that nearly 40% of the judges that he appointed to the Court of Appeals have demonstrated a history of hostility towards the LGBTQ community. Nearly 85% of Trump's circuit court nominees were white, and 80% were men, creating an unprecedented whitewashing of the judiciary system. And 85% of the circuit court nominees are or have been affiliated with the Federalist Society, which, if you are unfamiliar, is an organization that advocates for deeply conservative reading of the Constitution. And it has given a platform to many anti-LGBTQ plus activists who have argued against marriage equality, fought non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ workers, and sought to strip away parental rights of same-sex parents. And so the moral of the story is that there's still a lot of work to do in Georgia, and there's still a lot of work to do in this country. And I know we have one question to look at in the chat, but before we get there, I'll finish up with our last slide, which is really about some things that are other things that are happening in June that you might be interested in, some resources. And Eric is going to put in the chat some of the links to those resources, and then we'll get to the questions. And so, and we can then look up at our questions. And so the first, I'm going to read the first question, Eric, and then I'm going to throw it to you because that's what a good friend does. And I'm happy then to jump in. But what are public schools in Georgia doing to protect and help trans youth?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a number of schools with really great and strong GSAs, and so gender and sexuality alliances that are in schools that help really students who may be dealing with issues have that support from their other peers in the school system and from teachers who are allies and supporters and advocates. You also have, parent groups like PFLAG who, when there are issues in public schools, are there advocating on the behalf of parents, advocating on the behalf of students, and really making sure that folks are getting the protections that they need while they're, trying to get an education. And when all else fails, we call Lambda Legal, and we bring lawsuits against schools when we need to make sure that young folks are protected and feel safe in an environment that is meant to be just that. And so I don't know if you want to add anything additional to that at all, Michael.
Yeah. Yeah, and Eric, I think that you framed this in a really positive way of sort of organizations jumping in and groups, and I'm going to take a little bit of a different look at this, sort of the bad side of this, and that is there is nothing consistent happening across all of the counties and school districts in the state of Georgia. And so it really depends on where you go to school, on what your experience is going to be like. We have seen some school districts just, go out of their way to protect students and student rights and parents' rights. We have also seen administrators and superintendents stand up to do the right thing and then get completely pummeled by the public and do the place that people are leaving their jobs. And so it is hard enough to be a student in high school and junior high. I will just be really honest. I would never vote to go back and do high school over and junior high over. It is brutal. And the fact of the matter is, if you have to think every day about going to the bathroom and whether you're going to be harassed or even banned from using the bathroom, or given only access to one bathroom across the entire school, or not be able to play sports with your friends, or be harassed in the lunchroom and on the bus, you are just elevating the pressures that are faced by schools. And so we as a state haven't collectively passed laws that really protect and support students. And so Erick said, we call on Lambda Legal. Here's the thing, if folks call on us and we sue, this is not usually an overnight process. There are times where we will go in and point out that people have the freedom to say, wear a t-shirt that says "Make America Gay Again," which we had to get involved in a case like that. And a school will say, oh, okay, we're going to back down because we're violating the law, and we don't have to file suit. There are other times, like in the Andrew Adams case, where Andrew Adams and his family began working to resolve the issues that Andrew was facing his freshman year in high school. And guess what? Andrew just finished up his second year of college at the University of Central Florida, and that case is still going on. And so the process of being a part of this system to change the system in itself is really challenging. So the next question is, how can trans community navigate the new voting restrictions in Georgia, seen as the voting absentee option will now require a form of identification?
Yep. So what I actually did was I dropped into the chat the National Center on Trans Equality actually has a checklist that provides a really good strategy for folks. It is a bit of a mouthful, which is why I put the link there. But it does provide some good tools and resources for trans folks who are participating in the voting process.
Yeah. And the identification piece, I mean, is a major challenge and impacts you in every sort of part of your life. And again, we don't have anything consistent across the country on how we're doing IDs. And so this is really sort of the Wild West. And, it depends on what state, what jurisdiction you're in, on how you're going to be able to access an ID that reflects your name, your sex and gender, etc. So, and I think that was our last question. Add one more final resource I forgot to throw out. Lambda Legal has a help desk. So anybody out there that is experiencing discrimination or needs support, that help desk can be accessed at lambdalegal.org/helpdesk, easy enough. And that help desk is staffed by attorneys, and we received last year over 4,500 calls, and many of those calls come from the South. If we are not going to take a case through the help desk, we have a network of 1,800 cooperating attorneys, so we can connect people that do need help with those cooperating attorneys. So I just want to make sure that people know that is a resource for them.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that. I'm sure that that's definitely helpful for the community. Well, thank you so much again, Michael, Eric, for this wonderful presentation. And everyone have a good night and happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month.